So it's beautiful to see persons from all over the United States, mostly from the prairies, but have Presbytery of Twin Cities available here, and Minnesota. I know we have Monmouth Presbytery, which will soon be on. So we welcome you all. We are so grateful for your sharing your evening with us this evening. I'm just going to go ahead and begin as we continue to gather together, as Jerry allows us to come in on his Zoom platform. Welcome, welcome. I'm Diane Waddell. I moderate Earth Keepers of Heartland Presbytery, which is Heartland Presbytery's environmental sustainability and justice team. We're grateful for Dr. Bill Brown being with us this evening and tomorrow morning, and certainly grateful that you're all sharing your evening with us. As the time in the evening goes along, you will note that Dr. Brown will spend about an hour sharing with us in a beautiful presentation, very memorable presentation, which will be recorded. And then after that, we'll be allowed to share questions for Dr. Brown. This evening, we welcome you from Heartland Earth Keepers, and we welcome you from other faith-based organizations in the Kansas City area who will momentarily be greeting you as well. Let's go ahead and begin to put in information in the chat. But Joe and Rick Randolph and Jerry Reese are our techno people for this evening from Heartland Earth Keepers, as we have others who will be greeting us momentarily. But Joe and Rick will share exactly what we'd ask you to put in the chat so we can all get to know each other a little bit better. Shalom is one of our beautiful words for this evening, not only for this evening, but for every day. So welcome, and I want to introduce Joe Randolph, who will explain a little bit more about the chat.
Good evening. I wanted to let everybody know we are so thrilled to welcome Bill Brown here, but I also want to know, who are we? As in this world of creation, we are all together, but we come from different spots. So let us know your name, your presbytery or your church or both. And if you know the land of the indigenous peoples that were here before you, please list that for us too. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I am Chad Cooper. I am with Sustainable Sanctuary Coalition. We're an interfaith environmental organization based in Kansas City. And many of the folks on the call tonight have either been founders of Sustainable Sanctuary or board members or supporters. And if you're just now hearing about us, we appreciate you joining this important presentation tonight. So I just want to welcome each of you and thank you for connecting the importance of faith and caring for God's creation. So welcome.
Friends, I want to add my welcome as well. My name is Roger Nishioka. I'm one of the pastors here at Village Presbyterian Church. And on behalf of Village Presbyterian Church and our Environmental Action Committee, we also want to say welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us. I have the pleasure of introducing to you our presenter for this evening and for tomorrow. The Reverend Dr. Bill Brown is a holder of the William Marcellus McPheeters Chair in Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Although right now, Bill comes to us from his home in Montreat, North Carolina, which is the center of Presbyterianism for the entire world. Bill Brown, as a professor at Columbia, came to us. I was on the faculty there and had the privilege of teaching with Bill He is well known, especially in the Society for Biblical Literature. He is an amazing Old Testament scholar, and yet still is kind and gracious. Isn't that interesting? Kind and gracious in some ways, a difficult colleague on the faculty with me in others. Bill Brown is favored among students and faculty and much beloved. One of the reasons why students love Bill Brown so much is that he is so thoughtful and so prompt in responding to them through their papers. As a professor there for 15 years myself, I did not earn that same reputation. I was infamous for taking too long to get papers back to students. I had the great delight of originating a course with Dr. Bill Brown for 2 years with another professor, Kimberly Bracken-Long. And somehow along the way, the three of us as professors teaching this course together decided that we were all going to read all the students' papers, which was very lovely in the idea that we would all read all the students' papers. What that meant was every paper that came in had to be circulated among the three of us. And so when papers were assigned and they first started to come in, we divided the papers into 3 sections, and Kim would get a set, Bill would, and I would. And knowing Dr. Brown, I did my best to try turn those papers around. And on one set of papers, I recall this distinctly, on one set of papers, I turned my set of papers around in 2 days, which is remarkable for me and a sign that Jesus still does miracles in these days. And I was sort of proud about this, that I actually turned these papers around, my set, in 2 days. So I passed my papers, this was our rotation, on to Dr. Long, Kimberly Bracken-Long. And I said, these are my papers. And she said, great, I already got Bill's yesterday. I saw Bill later on in my hallway where my office was, and I greeted him with the love of Jesus and said, you're killing me, Brown. So friends, I'm delighted that Bill Brown has taken the time to join us and be with us. I am thrilled that we will have this conversation with him. So I invite you to mute yourself if you haven't already. That'll help get rid of external voices just for the time being. Later on, as you heard Diane Waddell tell you, there'll be a time for question and answer. And if you would, write those questions in the chat as we're going along. That will help as well. So in the chat, as you just heard Joe ask you to do, tell us who you are, the place from which you come. And if you know this, which I hope you do, the indigenous peoples who populated the land before you. And if you would also, any questions or comments, put those in the chat as the conversation is going along, and those will be raised up later on. Friends, it's a delight to introduce you to my friend and honored colleague, Bill Brown. I invite you to pray with me, please, as we start our conversation together. So as we pray, would you please take a deep breath in, and would you let it out slowly? And take a deep breath in, and let it out slowly. And breathe in God's mercies. And breathe out God's mercies to the whole of creation. And breathe in God's mercies. And breathe out your mercies to the whole of creation. So we thank you, God, for these are your mercies indeed. And these mercies come from you because you are a generous God and you are gracious beyond our knowing. We thank you, O God, for gifting us with brilliant minds like Bill Brown, thoughtful, great hearts like Bill Brown. And we pray your blessing upon him this evening and upon his loved ones, on his scholarship, on his study, and the ways that you are shaping him to shape us, indeed to shape your body of Christ, this church, to be even more faithful than we are now. So, God, gather us to you by the power of your Holy Spirit across this whole land and beyond, this land that you created and called good, and inspire us to be even more faithful followers of the risen Christ. For Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And for that we give thanks. And all God's people say, amen. Friends, my friend and colleague, Reverend Dr. William P. Brown.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Roger Nishioka. It is a pleasure to be with you all, and a shout out to Jerry and to Diane and to Joe and to Chad for getting this all together, for inviting me, and for all the support that they've been able to muster to make this happen. It is indeed my delight to share some thoughts about what I'm wrestling with, particularly the past year and a half. ever since the pandemic began, and what that has to say about our work together in creation care. And so tonight we're going to explore the notion of shalom, usually translated as peace, but to discover that shalom is a much wider, richer notion than we give it credit in our normal discourse, and even in our biblical translations as well. And so I entitled this presentation, Just Creation, in the sense that we're going to talk about creation justice and the relationship between peace and justice. But I need to point out to you something that I rarely do when I present. I'm wearing a bow tie, in case you haven't noticed. And I do that in honor of a kindred spirit who is a science popularizer. You may recognize him. Let's see if I can get going here. There he is. Yes, Bill Nye the Science Guy. He too wears a bow tie. And I love Bill Nye because I got to know him when I was quite a bit younger, and he was doing his science gig on PBS. And I learned much science from him back in the day. And he's most recently said these very choice words about where we're at in terms of our environmental situation. He says, I didn't mind explaining photosynthesis to you when you were 12, but you're adults now, and this is an actual crisis. Got it? By the end of the century, if temperatures keep rising, the average temperature on Earth could go up another 4 to 8 degrees. What I'm saying is the planet's on fire. So I tip my hat, I tip my bow tie to Bill Nye the Science Guy. And because of his great work in promoting awareness of climate change through the disciplines of science, I'm going to invite you to consider me as Bill Brown, the Bible Guy. And so what can a Bible guy contribute to the discussion about climate change and environmental justice through the lens of the ancient scriptures of what we call the Bible? Now, I could begin by saying I didn't mind teaching you about the Trinity in Sunday school when you were in confirmation class, but now you are adults. So what should I say next? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. That's what this evening is going to be about. What can Bill Brown, the Bible Guy, say about our condition of creation presently? And I want to frame this by enlisting the help of two major figures that may not be all that familiar to you with regards to creation care. One is the father of environmental justice, Robert Bullard. He continues to be the distinguished professor at Texas Southern University. I caught him on the PBS NewsHour. I guess it's been about 3 weeks, maybe a month now, when Texas suffered that catastrophic cold snap that pretty much collapsed the electrical power grid in Texas. And he was being interviewed by Judy Woodruff. You may have heard that interview as well. But he said, when we talk about climate change really has to be looked at as more than greenhouse gases and parts per million. We have to talk about the inequities that exist in our society that make certain communities more vulnerable. That is to say, climate change is more than rising temperatures and increasing our carbon footprint. It's also about social inequities. And what drives those social inequities that have been rampant for over 400 years here in this country, at least? And so I also want to refer to the father of Black liberation theology, James Cone, who said in this wonderful essay back in the year 2000, Whose Earth Is It Anyway? He said, the logic that led to slavery and segregation in the Americas, colonization and apartheid in Africa, is the same one that leads to the exploitation of animals and the ravaging of nature. It is a mechanistic and instrumental logic that defines everything and everybody in terms of their contribution to the development and defense of white world supremacy. James Cone is not alone, but he's the one who has championed this view that white supremacy has been there all along, ever since we started damaging the environment. And it is the link between environmental degradation and social inequities, racism, sexism, ableism, ageism. Yeah, it is a form of supremacy in all of its manifestations, white supremacy. And so that, for us as creation caregivers, if you will, those of us who are environmentally aware and want to do something about that, it behooves us to connect the dots, to find the intersections between creation care and justice. And so that means that as we experience, and will so even with more frequent, at a more frequent rate, of the quote unquote natural disasters that we know are anthropogenic, the increase of hurricanes and their severity, including then also more wildfires as well as flooding. And as we continue to emit more greenhouse gases and pollution and the like, we are familiar with all of that. But we also need to find those links also with the trauma of racialized violence, the displacement of indigenous folks and their impoverishment. And of course, as we know most recently, of course, many have known this for many, 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 many years, the wave of anti-Asian violence, particularly as we've seen during the pandemic. And of course, the victims of color, referring to police brutality, the refrain now, "I can't breathe," first from Eric Garner back in 2014 when he was choked to death, and most recently in the case of George Floyd, whose trial of the policeman is underway. "I can't breathe" is a refrain that I think cuts across so many realities of oppression and violence and systemic racism. It also can equally be applied to the earth itself with the burning of the Amazon forest and the pollution of the air, particularly for communities of color who live in particularly polluted areas in this country, at the very least. I can't breathe. And so what is it that links all of these realities that beset us together? James Cone would say it is white supremacy. More broadly, human supremacy against nature, most specifically white supremacy against communities of color. They all reflect each other. And we as environmentalists, it is time to recognize that more fully now than ever before. And I've come to realize that more now than ever before during this last year and almost a year and a half now, with the pandemic that has exposed so much of the social inequities that have been embedded and baked into American capitalism and our society for so long. So the lesson so far, we don't need to choose between creation care and social justice. This is not a case of creation care versus social justice. This is really a case of creation care as an extension of social justice, or reverse it, social justice as an extension of creation care. And that is to say, we are, I think, entering into a greater awareness of what I would call creation justice. In fact, for me now, creation care almost sounds a little paternalistic. I don't know about you. It is a favorite term among so many of us, and I acknowledge that and I honor that. But I'm moving more towards what I would call creation justice. And that has to do with reparation. That has to do with recognizing the rights of human and non-human living forms. Creation justice, it gives more of an urgency to this movement for me than simply sensitive creation care. We're going to talk more about that as we look at some biblical texts, including one of my favorite ecological texts in the Bible, perhaps a best kept secret among many of you. It's not from Genesis 1. It's not from Psalm 104. It's not even from the book of Job. We'll talk about some of these in due time. But for me, the starting point comes from Hosea chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. Hosea, one of the early 8th century prophets of ancient Israel, he says this in this indictment: "Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty, no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, and stealing, and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals and the birds of the air. Even the fish of the sea are perishing." I'll tell you what I think the most important word in this passage is. Therefore. It is that one word that links together the violations of the covenant that Hosea points out, particularly certain violations of the Ten Commandments, and the ecological degradation of the land, the mourning of the land, its languishing of the animals and the birds, and the perishing of the fish. Therefore, in fact, as a biblical scholar who works with the Hebrew on occasion, I would actually submit a different translation for that therefore. That therefore is not meant to be a signal of divine judgment, as if God were intervening and causing the land to mourn. No, the connection is much tighter than that. It's the issue of consequence, not judgment. And so I'm not alone in this translation I'm going to offer to you. Wilhelm Rudolph, one of my favorite German biblical scholars, made this his translation in his own commentary on Hosea. He suggested that the best translation for therefore is, "No wonder the land mourns, and all who live in it languish together, and even the fish of the sea are perishing." No wonder. And so what Hosea is saying here is that the breakdown of the human community, the breakdown of society, is reflected and is resulting in the degradation of the environment, of the non-human realm of life. That connection is one of consequence. One reflects the other. And so for me, this is one of those telling biblical passages, and from a prophet no less, who really understands the link between social violence and environmental violence. And so I once asked students in a class in which we were actually translating this passage to devise a sermon title if they were asked to preach on this passage. And one young man offered the title that I've always carried with since then, and that is simply "Stop and Smell the Dead Fish." And he actually preached on that. And so he began with ecological degradation, examples of that, and then he moved from there, from the outer, if you will, into the inner dynamics, oppressive dynamics of society, including racism. And seeing that with this ancient prophet, we have a precedent that who establishes the intersection between social justice and creation care. Stop and smell the dead fish. So there are other biblical passages that actually find this connection between justice and shalom, what we usually translate as peace. And so drawing from the NRSV translation of Psalm 85, verses 10 to 12, we have this beautiful picture of justice in creation. Steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. The Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase. And there's our word, peace, or shalom. And peace is not something isolated from the moral qualities of righteousness and faithfulness and justice, as we find in this next passage from Isaiah 32. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness abide in the fruitful field. The effect of righteousness will be peace, and the result of righteousness, quietness, and trust forever. My people will abide in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places. And there it is, justice and peace, coupled together. Where, though? In the wilderness, in the fruitful field, so that God's people can abide in a peaceful habitation, in security. Reminds me of that famous line in Micah chapter 4 that talks about, and everyone shall sit underneath their vine and underneath their fig tree in security. That is the vision of peace. That is also a just peace. Shalom. And there is justice in that for the security and safety of the most vulnerable. That's what peace is biblically. And Walter Brueggemann, my predecessor at Columbia Theological Seminary, puts it very well in his book on peace. Shalom is the end of coercion. Shalom is the end of fragmentation. Shalom is the freedom to rejoice. Shalom is the courage to live an integrated life in a community of coherence. These are not simply neat values to be added on. They are a massive protest against the central values by which our world operates. What are those central values? The commodification of the land, of the air, of the sea, the commodification of people, as evidenced in America's original sin. White supremacy, still reigning supreme in this country. And so shalom, the striving for shalom, is a protest. It is a counter movement. It is a resistance against the way this country operates. Thank you, Walter, for that. And I want to also thank Clifton Clark of Fuller Theological Seminary in a wonderful essay from Fuller Magazine several years ago, in which he doesn't want to talk about shalom in isolation. Clifton Clark wants to talk about shalom justice together as almost one word. Shalom justice requires that we challenge the corrupt and unjust laws and practices that oppress and discriminate on the basis of race and class. And so reading Dr. Clark's essay, and in conjunction with Dr. Brueggemann and with James Cone and with Robert Bullard, I now in my language, whenever I say shalom, I'm going to talk about shalom justice, because the one does not exist without the other. Yes, no justice, no shalom. That's the way it works in the Bible, and that's the way it should work today. So, with all of that as our framework, I want to dig deeply into the creation text of all creation texts, yes, Genesis 1. And I want to ask the question, is Genesis 1, even with all of its familiarity in our churches, preached on so often, perhaps you'll hear it again on Earth Day, or at least that week, a couple weeks from now in April. Is it a vision of shalom justice? That is, what does Genesis 1 look like when we look at it in terms of the distribution, the equitable distribution of power, the use of force, inclusion. Those matters, those ingredients of shalom justice that are so critical. So let's jump in, back to the beginning. And I want to begin with a less familiar translation, more of a paraphrase, to kind of really shock us into awareness out of our familiarity with Genesis 1. It begins like this. Now, when the Almighty was first down with his program, he made the heavens and the earth. Their earth was a fashioned misfit being so uncool and dark. But the Spirit of the Almighty came down real tough, so that he simply said, lighten up. And that light was right on time. And the Almighty liked what he saw and let the light hang out for a while before it was dark again. Now, granted, this is not a strict translation. I should know that because I've translated Genesis 1. But this comes as a wonderful paraphrase from P.K. McCary in a volume called Black Bible Chronicles, published in 1993. It confirms for me how subversive, how resistant is the phenomenon of joy. That is to say, if God's very first words in the Bible, if God's very first words in the cosmos and creating the cosmos were lighten up, it reminds me that joy is a part of what should move us as we work towards tikkun olam, to repairing the world, to implementing reparations on behalf of all life, towards the work of creation justice, to lighten up, because joy can be itself an attitude, a disposition of resistance. That is to say, we don't do this out of guilt. Guilt and shame may have some valence, but it should be outweighed by joy and a sense of wonder, because it is out of wonder. It is out of the wonder of what we love in creation and in each other that impels us most effectively, I think. So when you get particularly angered or despairing, think of God's very first words at the moment of creation. Lighten up and go forth. Well, from the poetic and inspired to the mundane, here is my own literal translation of Genesis 1. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was tohu vabohu, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while God's ruach hovered over the face of the waters. Then God said, let there be light. And there was light. Tohu vabohu, that is the poetic, alliterative way in the Hebrew to talk about a mishmash, what is usually translated as formless and void, what I elsewhere translate as vacuum and void. So God begins in this moment of chaos. And we have this picture of God's ruach, which can mean spirit, wind, breath, hovering over the face of the waters. And my translation here, I'm going to submit, is that ruach here means breath, because what does God do when God initially creates light? Then God said, God exhales, like exhaling the mercies of God into creation, as Roger led us in his prayer. This is what God does when God exhales. There is light. God's breath. And then God, this is 1 out of 10 times that God speaks creation into being. So it's all about God's breath. In the first case, uttering light into being. And the other word that really captivates me, this is my own translation, so it's a bit different. It is this mark of the description of the ruach of God hovering over the face of the waters. Now that's typically translated as sweeping or roiling the water, something a little more aggressive? I don't think so. I think this is more of the sense of God's breath suspended over the dark waters. And the only direct parallel we have of this verb comes from Deuteronomy 32, verse 11, which talks about the mother eagle hovering over her nest, checking on her brood, protecting her nest by hovering over it. And so there's really a sense of intimacy here. You might even think of maternal intimacy between God's breath hovering over the face of the waters. The tohu bohu does not present anything. It's not a source of animosity or antagonism or conflict at this initial part of creation. It is simply God hovering over the face of the waters, poised to create, poised to exhale. It's like holding the breath of God until the point it cannot be held any longer. And when it is unleashed, their light is unleashed. Now, some of us may not sound so provocative until we compare that to another creation account that coexisted with the account of creation in Genesis 1, and it is the imperial account of creation that we have from the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which existed from 626 to 539 BCE, in which the exiles of Israel were under the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonians had their own epic account of creation. And I want to kind of familiarize yourselves with this. I want to make you familiar with these, with this document that you might say is even canonical throughout the ancient Near East. The exiles in Babylon, I think, were fully aware of the Enuma Elish, which is the first two words of the Babylonian account of creation. When on high is the translation. And Genesis 1, I'm going to argue, was a response to this imperialistic account of creation. And so the account that we have in the Enuma Elish is all about a conflict, a sort of clash of the titans between specifically Marduk, the god of Babylon, and Tiamat, the god of chaos. And without reading the whole thing to you, which I'm not going to do, thanks be to God, I'm going to highlight through this iconic depiction on this stamp seal, in which you see Tiamat is depicted as a sea dragon right here. And there's Marduk, who is engaged in battle with Tiamat. And that's the bulk of the account of creation in the Enuma Elish. And so one thing I do want to read, because it really highlights a contrasting moment between the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1. How does Marduk, the conqueror of Tiamat, begin to create? We've already talked about how God creates in Genesis 1. God said, "Let there be light," God's spirit hovering over the face of the deep. This is what Marduk does. So after having conquered Tiamat, Marduk rested and inspected her corpse. He divided the monstrous shape and created marvels. He sliced her in half like a fish for drying. Half of her he put up to the roof, to roof the sky. He drew a bolt across and made a guard hold it. The waters he arranged so that they could not escape. And just a couple verses later, it says that Marduk pierced the eyes of Tiamat in order to form the headwaters of the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is an imperial, violent account of creation. And the Israelites in exile were very much aware of this account of creation. It was celebrated every year during the New Year's festival in Babylon, in which all the governors and officials were gathered together in order to sustain the imperial hold of Babylon over the ancient Near East. And this probably was dramatically portrayed, not just read. So, for the Enuma Elish, for Marduk and Tiamat, there is this ancient imperial logic that creation can only come about through conquest, violence. Creation comes from conquest. It's always conquest first and then creation. Not so with God's breath hovering over the waters of chaos, like a mother eagle over her nest. And then when we read more about God's creative activity in Genesis 1, we read about God enlisting the earth to put forth plant life. Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees. And it was so. And so the earth does that. The earth brings forth vegetation, plants and trees and the like. What is God doing? God is enlisting other agents of creation, in this case, the earth, to bring forth life. God is not conquering anything. God is collaborating. This is a dramatic, resistant testimony of the use of power on the part of the deity. Marduk in violence and conquest, God in collaboration. It is the process of Shalom at work. Same thing with God's creative activity underwater. Then God said, let the waters produce swarms of living beings. So God created the great sea monsters and every living being that moves, of which the waters produce swarms according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Here, interestingly enough, God commands the waters to produce the fish of the sea, swarming creatures. And then it said God created the great sea monsters and everything that moves in the waters, of which the waters produce swarms. This is collaboration between God and the waters. God is not conquering the waters. God is enlisting the waters. And here is, for me, one of the greatest sea monsters that God and the waters have ever created in collaboration. Do you recognize it? Fierce as it is. Yes, it is the tardigrade, or affectionately known as the water bear, perhaps the most resistant animal form of life on this planet. This tiny little monster, a mascot of resilience, particularly in very extreme conditions that, of course, would be so inhospitable for other forms of animal life. And then God's creative activity on the land. And God said, let the earth, once again, bring forth creatures of every kind, cattle, creeping things, wild animals. And it was so. And then God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind. Yeah, so it's like God is being a good Presbyterian, because Presbyterians love to do things by committee. And God is the chair of the committee. And the members of the committee include the earth and the waters, and God tells them, go forth and create life according to their kinds. And then when they do, God takes the credit. God, the chair of the creation committee. And the same thing goes for the creation of humankind. Once again, God is collaborating. Let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. Yeah. Now, we ecological readers of the biblical text do have a legitimate problem with the word dominion, which has frequently been interpreted as stewardship. But let me reinforce to you first and foremost that what's going on here is something that verges on the movement of justice. Because what God is doing here in Genesis 1 is declaring that God's image, the image of God, is shared by all humanity. And in Babylon or Assyria, even in Egypt, those superpowers, those imperial kingdoms of the ancient Near East, the language of the image of God was always relegated to the king. Only the king was the image of God. Only the king represented the deity. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was born from the gods. but not the rest, not the subjects of the kingdom. In Genesis 1, God's image becomes, if you will, democratized or universalized. All human beings share in God's image. That is a remarkable move on the part of the priestly author of Genesis 1. Male and female. So, yeah, we're going to talk a little more about dominion in a moment. But I want to contrast that with the creation of humankind according to the Enuma Elish, the epic of creation in Babylon. And so after the conquest, after the defeat of the rebel gods, including Tiamat, there is another rebel god who is slain. They bound, his name is Kingu, holding him before Ea, the god of wisdom. They inflicted the penalty on him and severed his blood vessels from his blood. Ea created humankind on whom he imposed the service of the gods and set the gods free. According to the Enuma Elish, humanity does not represent the image of God, though humanity comes from the blood, the violence of a rebel deity. And humanity is relegated to the service of the gods, so that the gods could be free, so that they no longer had to be building canals for the kingdom of Babylon. But in God's image that we find in Genesis 1, we have something liberative, something just that endows dignity for all human individuals and communities. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you another image that has been a relatively new image for me with reference to God's image as depicted in Genesis 1. I used to think, and I used to, in fact, even in a children's sermon years ago, I talked about Genesis 1, the image of God, and talked about how each of us holds a mirror of God within ourselves. We reflect God's image. Now, it could be a marred image through sin, if you will, but the problem with that is that by talking about God's image as a mirror, we relegate the notion of God's image to one kind of quality or property of human consciousness, like rationality or like consciousness. And we think of that as the one attribute of God that we embody. And that can be dehumanizing. And so I want to suggest to you, instead of a mirror, a prism. And as you know, and here I am, Bill Brown, the science guy, also Bible guy, as you pass a beam of light through one side of a prism, out from the other side is the spread of the various wavelengths of colors in the visual spectrum. And there are more colors beyond the visual spectrum, as you know. There is a diversity here. And another quality of that diversity in the visual color spectrum is the sort of, it's not cleanly delineated, these bands of color. As you move from infrared light to ultraviolet light or the other way around, it's like you're merging into one color rather than crossing hard set boundaries between these colors in this visual color spectrum. And that is to say then that refraction, I think, is the better metaphor when it comes to refracting God's presence. I almost said reflecting again. That is to say that God's image is refracted in the diversity and the plurality of humanity, in all of our gendered identities and our ethnicities and our cultures. We can burrow down even into our own family of origins and experiences and backgrounds, that God can be refracted in all of those diversity, and all of that diversity that reflects humanity. So what about dominion? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Is it stewardship? Well, maybe it is for Genesis 1, but you may have had some problems with stewardship over the years, as I have, because stewardship sort of gives humanity the position of micromanager, the one who is always exercising control over creation. Is that the kind of model we want? Certainly the human species is the most powerful species on earth, and we need to exercise our power for the flourishing of all creation. But is stewardship the way to go? Some have suggested, and I'm leaning in this direction now, partnership and reciprocity. That is to say, we are engaged in partnership for the sake of the flourishing of all of life. It is recognizing that nature has rights too. And then I always like to lift up the example of Noah. If we want to retain the language of dominion in Genesis 1, however problematic that is, we also have to recognize that Noah is the one who fulfills most completely the mandate to exercise dominion over creation in Genesis 1. And what does Noah do? He commits an act of justice as commanded by God. He implements the First Endangered Species Act. Sure, that's an act of care, but it's also an act of justice. And then leading after what Noah does by preserving the diversity of life on the ark, and all the animals come out of the ark, and Noah and his family in Genesis 9. What does God do? God makes a covenant, not just with Noah, but with all the creatures of the earth in all of their diversity. Each species, each one, is a recipient of God's covenant to be preserved, to flourish, never to be destroyed again. That is an act of covenantal justice on the part of God. And so I simply offer to you the CEB translation of Genesis 1, verse 26. It's not to exercise dominion over creation. The Common English Bible has it so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea and the wild animals of the earth. Maybe that's a slight improvement. It is, by taking charge, we take on responsibility for the flourishing of life. And that, I think, is what Genesis 1 is really getting at. It is a charge for us to take responsibility for our actions, because we do have the power to do so, to either sustain creation or to destroy it. So if we take a step back and look at the 7 marks of creation's goodness, which is a word that's repeated 7 times in Genesis 1. Creation is done decently and in order. That's another inside Presbyterian joke. We love to do everything decently in order. And Genesis 1 is a classic example of creation done decently and in order, methodically, systematically, without drama, incrementally, if you will. Every day building on the previous day. And that the process is one of collaboration, the use of non-coercive power on the part of God, like Marduk slaying Tiamat and creating humankind. The God in Genesis is more about relational power, non-coercive power. Genesis 1's creation account affirms creation sustainability. There are 2 things in Genesis 1 that make creation sustainable: seeds and plants that bring about the succession of plants, and yes, sex. Multiply, be fruitful and multiply. And that is a mandate, a blessing that's given not just for humanity, it's given for the animals. In fact, that mandate is given first to the animals before it's given to human beings. And there's an aesthetic quality as well to the goodness of creation. There's a beauty to it, as we all know, as lovers of nature. And the priestly author of Genesis 1 was no doubt a lover of nature as well. It is that beauty that's reflected in the interdependence and diversity of life. Again, with every day, day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7, each one is built on the previous day. And one of the perhaps less well-known leitmotifs of Genesis 1 is the word for kind or kinds, each according to its kinds. That's repeated every time life is created. Kinds, the diversity of the species. There's a beauty to that. There's a value to that. And of course, there's Sabbath, completion and rest. Sabbath. In Sabbath, there is rest, and in rest, there is freedom. There is the freedom for rest. And it begins with God and extends then as the fourth commandment of the Decalogue for us as well. And then there's it's sort of a recent discovery for me, it's what I call broken binaries that Genesis 1 hints at. It's not all that explicit, but let me go into further detail. So Genesis 1 does set up certain binaries, one of which, maybe the most primordial, is light and darkness, or day and night. But the account also recognizes morning and evening. That is to say, when each day is delineated, it's given this formulaic expression, and there was morning, there was evening, and there was morning the first day, the second day, all the way to the sixth day. That is to say, dawn and dusk, morning and evening. That's where light and darkness merge together in varying degrees, just like that color spectrum. Land and sea. On the third day, the land emerges out of the sea and creates some boundaries so that the sea can be contained in bodies of water. But for the exiles living in Babylon, they also were very much aware of marshes and estuaries and deltas. That is where the land and the sea intermingle in various forms. And in fact, as we know, as you know, and as I know, these particular areas have their own ecosystems and their own profiles of life and all of their diversities. And then there is the binary of male and female. And though Genesis 1 does not explicate any further, this is the first distinction that Genesis 1 makes regarding humanity, that is to share the image of God. But as we know today, there is a whole spectrum of sexual orientations and gender identities that need to be acknowledged and honored as equally sharing in God's image. And so these binaries begin to break down. They do so in the text and in extension from the text of Genesis 1. And that's part of the expansive view of what is good. Very good, in fact, in the language of Genesis 1. So, to bring ourselves to a conclusion about just shalom or shalom justice in Genesis 1, I want to introduce to you, some of you may already be aware of that, of what I call the Genesis Code, which is as earth-shaking as the Da Vinci Code, but the Genesis Code has its difference in that this is true. And it goes like this. If you take a step back and look at how the text is structured, we begin with day 1 with the creation of light. Day 2 is the creation of sky, that is the waters above held forth by the firmament and the waters below. And then day 3 is the creation of land and vegetation. And then day 4, the creation of lights, the lesser light to rule the night, the greater light to rule the day. That is the moon and the sun, and the stars are mentioned as well. Day 5, we have the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the great sea monsters. And then finally, on the 6th day, we have land animals and human beings. There is this symmetry that lines up so well between days 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6. But I want to point out something more that I've really not appreciated until much more recently. And that is that on the left-hand column, I'm going to start using my magic pen. You have these domains. the domains of light and sky and waters, vegetated land. Now remember that God enlisted the waters and the earth, which included the land, in order to produce life. They were and remain agents of creativity. They are agents of creation. That is to say, you might call them empowering environments, or maybe simply creational agencies. They are, the Bible actually thinks of them as living these domains. And then in the right-hand column, the lights, which correspond to light, this is interesting. They are akin to light as the birds of the air are akin to the sky, and marine life to the waters, and the land animals to the land. That is, the lights, the sun, the moon, and the stars are considered in this column as entities of life. There's something alive about them. That is to say, let's see if I can, yeah, there it is. We have on the left-hand side living domains, and on the right-hand side, living entities. And the living domains have their rights as much as the living entities on the right-hand side, because they're all interlinked. Birds of the air cannot be alive without the sky, without the air, the atmosphere. Marine life, no existence unless we have the waters, and land animals from the land. So, and we get this throughout much of the Old Testament, is that there are living landscapes, the earth, the ground, the seas. They're active in their own right. They are their own agencies, as much as the agencies that are human or non-human animals. And even, okay, we know from astrophysics that the stars aren't breathing entities, to be sure, but astrophysicists like to talk about the stars as having their own life cycles and their violent deaths that give life by spewing out heavier atoms into the deep, dark space. And then there's the seventh day, which ends up being sort of a loner, an outsider. No partner with any of these. Nope. Day 7 stands alone. And in fact, it is unique. It is a holy day. The only day that is given that label, holiness, as everything else is considered good, repeated 7 times. But the 7th day is holy, the Sabbath day. Well, there's one other level to this that needs to be for. We line up the days, with the exception of day 7. This threefold structure reflects what every ancient reader of Genesis recognized, and that is the structure of the cosmos. The structure of creation reflects the architecture of the temple. Threefold structure: the porch, the nave, and the Holy of Holies. It is in the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the temple, where God was said to reside. There, the Ark of the Covenant functioning as the footstool of God, no less. And on the 7th day, that is the holy day of God's rest. And so we have this perfect correspondence between God's residence in the temple and the Holy of Holies and God's rest on the holy day, the 7th day, the Sabbath. And if you don't believe me, here is the structure of the tabernacle in its threefold form: the outer courtyard on the right, or the porch, the entrance, the nave, or the holy place, and the Holy of Holies there in the back. And if we tip Genesis 1 on its end, we have that same structure. And if we stare at this long enough, yeah, then hypnotically, maybe I will convince you of this design, an intentional design, to be sure. So for me, the message of Genesis 1 is that creation is God's cosmic sanctuary, and that the process of creation is one of communal collaboration, in which the earth and the waters are enlisted in this cooperative exercise in the creation of life and the divine assembly. When God says, let us create humankind in our image, there's the divine assembly. Christian tradition identifies the Trinity there. Let's not forget the earth and the waters of having a hand in our creation as well. It's all about collaboration. So different from the imperial version of creation that we find in Babylon. And if creation is God's cosmic sanctuary, then why would we do anything to efface it, given its sacredness? So, this creation account was written by exiles in Babylon. And for them, it was a testimony of God's work from chaos to community. That's how God works. And for the exiles in Babylon, they were suffering from displacement, disorientation, chaos. They were in a place of tohu vabohu, uprooted from their homes. And for them, this testimony of God's work was something that is empty towards the fullness of life and all of its diversity. That was a testimony of hope for them, that God could even reconstitute this isolated community. This God of the primordial beginning is also the God of new beginnings. That is, if God can create order out of chaos, if God can create life out of emptiness, God can most certainly create a new beginning for this community that has suffered the captivity of exile. The God of one beginning, the most ancient of beginnings, can do this again and again and again, the God of new beginnings. And for a people whose temple has been destroyed, there were no temples in Babylon for the Israelites to perform worship, but to recognize that all of creation itself is a cosmic temple. That was a most profound insight of these exiles as they crafted Genesis 1. And so from isolation to collaboration, the process of creation. And so what I want to impress upon you is that Genesis 1 was an act of nonviolent resistance against Babylonian supremacy and assimilation. It was a way of retaining their identity as God's people on foreign soil. It was a way of resisting the lure of imperial Babylon. It was an act of resistance, Genesis 1. And so today, as we look at creation, our world, our common home through the lens of Genesis 1, we look at this as an outcome of divine collaboration, of joy, lighten up, of God's passion to create, of exhaling God's ruach and breath, the beauty, the goodness, the sustainability of this creation that exists as what Carl Sagan refers to as a blue marble, this exceptional piece of creation right here. It is our common home. And so it is this interdependence that is celebrated in Genesis 1 that is also, as you know, noted and affirmed by Dr. King. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so for me, as I look at this creation of God, of which I am a part, and of which you are a part, I can only think of the inextricable, inescapable network of mutuality that combines people and place. And so we have seen the ravages of when people are othered, when they are subordinated, when they are dehumanized and considered subhuman because they are strange to my eyes as a self-identified white, privileged person. And so there is that injustice that occurs and has been occurring throughout American history. But in tandem with that is what I would call is elswearing, in which not only are certain people considered disposable, but places are disposable as well. Sacrifice zones. And of course, people need places. People belong. People must have a sense of belonging to a place in order to flourish. And so the othering and the elswearing, they fit hand in glove, just as creation care and social justice fit hand and glove. And there is a word. There is just one word that combines these two together. It is a simple word. It is a powerful word. It is a very familiar word, but one that I think takes on new meaning in such a time as this. It is home. Home is where people and places are conjoined. I wish people cared about the earth as much as they cared about who they believe created it. This wonderful piece of craftivism by a 12-year-old. Yeah, God and creation, that intersection as well. You can't love God without loving creation. And so, where is this home taking us? Well, the Bible itself ends on a note of homeward boundedness, because John, another exiled, in this case on the island of Patmos, sees a vision of the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, and then hears a voice from the throne. See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them as their God, and they will be God's peoples, and God will be with them, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. What could some of those first things be? Racism, sexism, colonialism, violence. Those are the things that need to pass away as the result of God coming home. And when God comes home, God is not set on destroying the world and rapturing a few folks to have a first row seat on the earth's destruction, to look at it. Now God is coming home to earth. God is coming here. And when that happens, creation will be transformed. And so I want to end on Psalm 98 and sharing with you a recent exegetical discovery of mine that is not portrayed in any translation. I was hoping that the CEB would, but they didn't quite get there. But look what Psalm 98, it is an enthronement psalm. It's all about celebrating God's sovereignty over all of creation. And it is a cause for joy. Sing praises to the Lord with the lyre and the sound of melody, with trumpets and the sound of the horn. Make a joyful noise before the King, the Lord. Let the sea roar and all that fills it, the world and those who live in it. Let the floods clap their hands. Let the hills sing for joy together at the presence of the Lord. And then why, one might ask, are these elements of creation, the floods, the seas, the hills, why are they rejoicing? You see, they have a voice. They too have a voice in praise. But why? What's happening? The next verse tells us, for God is coming to establish justice for the earth. God will establish justice for the world with righteousness and the peoples with equity. To establish justice for the earth, for all the earth, for all life, humans included, and beyond. God is coming home to establish justice for the earth. And we are to join God in that journey of justice for the earth. So, Bill Brown, the Bible guy, what am I to say to encapsulate all that we have talked about, all that I have talked about? So I could begin again. I didn't mind teaching you about the Trinity in Sunday school when you were in confirmation class, but you are now adults. This is an actual crisis. And taking my inspiration from Bill Nye, the science guy, I would continue to say the world is burning up from rising greenhouse gases and also from unrelenting racism, from exercising domination over communities of color and the larger biotic community. And then I would end with this statement that is so often quoted in even civil religion, if you will, from Micah chapter 6, verse 8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? There it is, to do justice, to love chesed in Hebrew, and to walk humbly with your God. To walk with God, the God who is coming to establish justice for the earth. Thanks be to God. And so that ends my presentation. And I want to open it for conversation and questions and the like. Oh my, 42 questions already. Yikes. How much time do we have left? I've already gone over time. We do. I'm going to leave that to Chad and Diane to manage.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Brown. That was so beautiful, and such a beautiful concept of home and homeness and our being home with God. Joe and Rick have pulled out 2 questions which particularly represent all of those, the questions that were asked that we will at least start with. So I will begin with the first one. And the question is, does the term co-creators with God suggest arrogance by humans? Does that mean humans are thought of as arrogant?
What a great question. I think if we extend the notion of co-creation beyond humans, Genesis 1 is pretty clear on that. In fact, the earth and the waters are co-creators when they give forth life as commanded by God. God enlists them as co-creators. And so I like the way, I think it is John Polkinghorne, that Episcopal priest and quantum physicist, who says that God created a creating creation. God created a creating creation. We're all co-creators. And so it can be a form of arrogance if we just limit that sense of co-creation to human beings. But if we extend that to the rest of creation, then maybe it's not so arrogant after all. I mean, for me, it is an honoring of the fact that, of course, we are the most technologically advanced species on this planet, but it is also to recognize that there are other primates and other species that have their own technologies too. We're just beginning to discover this thing. So I would say simply that it's recognizing that even animals, non-human animals, also are co-creators as well. And I think with that recognition, then it doesn't necessarily be a form of self-aggrandizement.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way to understand that. Beautiful. Thank you so much. The second question, as people are beginning or continuing to ask, is this one. Can you comment on the role of wisdom in the creation story of the earth in Proverbs 8?
So we might actually go into a little bit of that tomorrow morning. So Proverbs 8 is another creation account. It's very different in style and substance from Genesis 1. I always feel we need to talk about Genesis 1 because it's a certain primacy of prey, because it's there at the very beginning. But there are other accounts of creation as well, Proverbs 8 being one of them. And so there, wisdom and God are maybe co-creators as well. In fact, it's interesting that when God says, let us create humankind in our image in Genesis 1, we Christians tend to think of the Trinity at work, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But Jewish tradition actually proposes, Jewish tradition proposes it's God and wisdom. God enlists wisdom to create humankind. And whether coincidentally or not, what do we call ourselves? Homo sapiens, the wise human, the wise person. That may be a form of self-arrogance as well. But in any case, there's a connection there to be sure. In Proverbs 8, there's a greater sense of liveliness and playfulness at work in the process of creation that you don't get in Genesis 1. And so these other creation accounts maybe address certain perceived deficiencies that we find in Genesis 1. It's not the end-all answer to all creation accounts. Proverbs 8, in fact, if you connect that to Proverbs 3, in which it is said that the Lord by wisdom created, that is to say that creation reflects God's wisdom. And for Proverbs 8, and particularly Psalm 1, the diversity of life is a reflection of God's wisdom. And when we reflect on how so many by year, we are diminishing the wisdom of God in creation, the wisdom that was reflected in the very genesis of this plethora of species. And we know the value of diversity. Even when it comes to the stopping the spread of pathogens, diversity does that. But what have we done? Like COVID-19, we have destroyed natural habitats. We have lessened the diversity of creation. We have encroached upon the wilderness. What do we get? We get another pandemic. There's a lesson there, to be sure. So yeah, wisdom and creation, they have an inseparable bond according to biblical tradition. More emphasized in Proverbs 8, to be sure, than Genesis 1.
Thank you. The beautiful words and the hovering that you began with, of God's hovering in such gentleness in creation, and the wisdom and the shalom. Leave us and send us to our home this evening with your wisdom, and we can continue to ponder that, as well as this good segue as we look towards tomorrow with Proverbs. It's been a beautiful evening. I don't see any other questions that Joe and Rick have passed on. But at this point, then, Dr. Brown, if you have any final comments or gatherings and then if you could just benedict us, give us a benediction or prayer as we end the evening. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I think in light of what's been said this evening, let me just say, go forth and serve the Lord, do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God, with our God, and be co-conspirators in God's kingdom, which extends beyond ourselves and throughout this rich and plentiful and abundant world that God created very good. May we walk with God to come home, to go home, so that creation itself can be a home for all life. So go forth, walk with God, who is coming home here in the consummation of history. Yes, Amen. Thanks be to God. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow morning as we venture into some of the wisdom literature and read the wisdom accounts through the lens of Shalom justice. See where that takes us.